In the waning light of the 13th century, Anatolia was a fractured landscape, a tapestry of fading Seljuk power, Byzantine remnants, and a sea of independent Turkish beyliks vying for dominance. Amid this chaos, a small frontier principality, hardly more than a rugged strip of land on the edges of Byzantine territory, began to rise. At its helm was a chieftain named Osman, a man whose ambitions would set the course of history. From the embers of crumbling empires, Osman ignited a flame that would one day stretch across 3 continents. This is where the Ottoman story begins, not in marble palaces or grand battlefields, but in the quiet, determined vision of a single man. Osman was born around 1258 in the town of Sagat, a frontier post in the shadow of the collapsing Seljuk Sultanate of Rum. His tribe, the Kay, belonged to the larger Oghuz Turkish Confederation. Like many nomadic Turkic groups, the Kay had migrated westward in the wake of the Mongol invasions that devastated Central Asia. They sought opportunity, land, and survival, and Osman offered all 3. What set Osman apart from the many other beyliks was not just his military skill, but his ability to inspire loyalty, forge alliances, and cloak his conquest in religious legitimacy. Legend tells a prophetic dream, a divine vision where a great tree grew from Osman's chest, spreading its shade across the world. This dream, interpreted by his mentor Shiki Bali, was taken as a heavenly sign. Osman's descendants were destined to rule an empire. This vision was not simply mystical folklore. It gave Osman and his lineage a potent mythic origin, tying their rule to divine will. This narrative would become a powerful tool in future centuries, justifying conquest and unity under a single Islamic banner. Osman's early campaigns were opportunistic but strategic. Positioned at the edge of the Byzantine Empire, his Ghazis, warriors of faith, raided Christian territories under the pretext of religious warfare. However, these weren't random raids. Osman began capturing forts, towns, and key trade routes. He took advantage of Byzantine weakness and infighting, slowly expanding his territory. In 1301, he defeated a Byzantine force at the Battle of Beyfus, a turning point that marked the first significant Ottoman military victory and a rallying cry for new recruits. The Ottomans under Osman cultivated a unique dual identity. To the Islamic world, they were Ghazi warriors, holy conquerors. To the local populations, including Christian peasants disillusioned with the heavy Byzantine tax burden, the Ottomans offered stability and pragmatic governance. Osman didn't rule with indiscriminate cruelty. Instead, he allowed local communities, even Christian ones, to retain a degree of autonomy under the millet system, an approach that would later become a hallmark of Ottoman rule. When Osman died around 1323 or 1324, his son Orhan inherited more than just land. He inherited a rising state with ambition, structure, and a charismatic legacy. Orhan would go on to capture Bursa in 1326, transforming it into the first true Ottoman capital and signaling the Ottomans' transformation from a tribal confederation to a state apparatus. But it was Osman who laid the foundation. From a modest Anatolian chieftainship, Osman's principality became the seed of what would evolve into one of history's most formidable empires. His reign was not about glittering conquests or towering architecture, but about laying the groundwork, building alliances, embedding ideology, and most importantly, creating a dynasty that would endure for over 6 centuries. The world had barely taken notice of Osman's small realm when he passed away. After all, many Turkish beyliks emerged and disappeared in the volatile landscape of post-Seljuk Anatolia. But Osman's dream, rooted in faith, driven by ambition, and wrapped in myth, would continue to grow. It's fitting that the name Ottoman itself derives from Osman, the Latinized version of his name, the very identity of the empire, even at its height under Suleiman the Magnificent, would continue to echo the quiet determination of its founder. Osman would become both legend and legacy. The first brick was set in the fog of medieval Anatolia, but that stone, placed by a humble warrior chief, will hold together a vast and diverse empire for centuries. And as we trace the Ottoman story from its majestic heights to its tragic fall, it's important to remember that it all began with Osman's vision, a world-spanning tree rooted in faith, grown in conflict and watered by ambition. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople stood as the beating heart of Eastern Christendom, a city shrouded in majesty, myth, and resilience. It was the last echo of the Roman Empire and the prized capital of Byzantium. For centuries, it had repelled invaders, endured sieges, and stared down the ambitions of empires. But in 1453 it would fall, not to a crusading army, but to a young, determined sultan named Mehmed II. With that fall, the medieval world gasped its last breath, and the Ottomans strode boldly into the future. This was not just a conquest. It was a transformation. When Mehmed II ascended the Ottoman throne for the second time in 1451, he was just 19 years old. His first reign had been brief and politically tumultuous, but now, with his father Murad II dead and rival silenced, Mehmed was ready to prove himself. He wasn't content with ruling an empire in waiting. He wanted to reshape the world. And to do that, he needed a capital worthy of an empire, and so his eyes turned to Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire by this time was a shadow of its former self, reduced to the city of Constantinople and a few scattered territories. Yet despite its decline, the city's walls had remained impregnable. Crusaders had stormed it in 1204, but the Byzantines had reclaimed it decades later. Every Muslim ruler before Mehmed who dreamed of taking the city had failed. Mehmed saw this as more than military strategy. It was prophecy. A hadith attributed to Prophet Muhammad had said, "Verily, you shall conquer Constantinople. What a wonderful leader will her conqueror be, and what a wonderful army will that army be." Mehmed believed he was that leader. He would not only take the city, he would take history itself by the throat. In preparation, he built up his military forces like never before. His most ambitious creation was a massive cannon, the basilica, cast by the Hungarian engineer Urban. This monster of a weapon could fire a 600-pound stone ball over a mile. It was designed specifically to breach Constantinople's formidable Theodosian walls, which had stood unbroken for centuries. In April 1453, Mehmed's army, around 80,000 strong, including elite Janissaries cavalry and auxiliaries, surrounded the city. Opposing them were only about 7,000 defenders, including Venetian and Genoese allies, under command of the noble but doomed Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last Byzantine emperor. For 53 days the siege raged. Cannon fire shook the ancient walls. Ottoman ships, in a legendary maneuver, were hauled overland to bypass the chain boom protecting the Golden Horn harbor. The defenders fought valiantly, repelling wave after wave of assaults. But time, hunger, and relentless bombardment were on Mehmed's side. On May 29, 1453, as dawn broke, Mehmed launched his final massive assault. After hours of fierce combat, Ottoman forces breached the walls and poured into the city. Emperor Constantine XI died fighting, his body never definitively identified, lost beneath the weight of history. The city fell, but Mehmed did not unleash indiscriminate destruction. While his troops were initially allowed to plunder, he quickly reasserted control. Standing in the Hagia Sophia, the great church of Eastern Christendom, Mehmed ordered its conversion into a mosque. This single act symbolized the empire's pivot, from conquering force to governing civilization. Mehmed declared Constantinople the new Ottoman capital and renamed it Constantini, though in time it would be known as Istanbul. The conquest was more than symbolic. It united the Ottoman territories in Europe and Asia, making administration more efficient and culturally cohesive. Mehmed invited Muslims, Christians, and Jews to repopulate the city, establishing the multi-ethnic, multi-faith fabric that would characterize Ottoman rule for centuries. Mehmed earned the title Fadi, the conqueror, and rightly so. But he was more than a warlord. He immediately set about transforming the city. He rebuilt infrastructure, reopened markets, established WACs, charitable foundations, and sponsored art, science, and scholarship. Under his patronage, Istanbul became not only the heart of an empire, but one of the world's great metropolises. The fall of Constantinople shocked Europe. It marked the end of the Byzantine Empire, a millennia-old continuation of Rome, and cemented the Ottomans as the preeminent power in the eastern Mediterranean. Many in the West saw it as a catastrophe. Some even believed it heralded the apocalypse. But for the Muslim world, it was a moment of triumph, a fulfillment of religious prophecy, and a sign that a new imperial age had begun. Mehmed's conquest reverberated far beyond military strategy. It triggered the Renaissance in Western Europe, as Greek scholars fled westward carrying ancient manuscripts. It forced European powers to seek new trade routes, fueling the age of exploration, and it launched the Ottoman Empire into a golden century of dominance. The boy sultan, who had once been dismissed as inexperienced and idealistic, had just achieved what countless armies had failed to do. In doing so, he not only seized a city, he seized destiny. In the annals of empire, few names resonate with the splendor and power of Suleiman the Magnificent, known in the Islamic world as Kanuni, the lawgiver, and in Europe as Magnificent. Suleiman I's reign from 1520 to 1566 marked the golden age of the Ottoman Empire. Under his rule, the empire reached its territorial zenith, stretched its influence across Europe, Asia, and Africa, and solidified its place as the dominant power of its time. He was not just a conqueror, but a visionary reformer, a patron of the arts, and a ruler whose court rivaled and often surpassed those of Europe's most celebrated monarchs. Suleiman was born in 1494 in Trabzon, on the eastern shores of the Black Sea, the son of Sultan Suleiman, a ruthless and ambitious ruler who had dramatically expanded Ottoman holdings in the Middle East. Suleiman inherited not just an empire, but momentum of conquest and consolidation. Unlike many heirs to the throne, Suleiman was well-educated, fluent in multiple languages, including Arabic, Persian, and Ottoman Turkish. He studied theology, law, history, and poetry. This combination of martial inheritance and intellectual depth would shape his reign in profound ways. His ascension in 1520 was met with skepticism by European powers. Many assumed the young sultan would be distracted by internal politics or prove to be a passive ruler. They were mistaken. Almost immediately, Suleiman launched campaigns to expand the empire further west. In 1521, he captured Belgrade, a crucial fortress of Christian Europe. A year later, he seized the island of Rhodes from the Knights of St. John, securing dominance over the eastern Mediterranean. But it was in 1526, at the Battle of Mohacs, that Suleiman delivered a crushing blow to Hungary. His forces overwhelmed the Hungarian army in a matter of hours, killing King Louis II and effectively dismantling the Hungarian monarchy. This victory not only opened the gates to Central Europe, but also ignited fear throughout the continent. The Ottomans were no longer just a distant threat. They were at Europe's doorstep. 2 years later, in 1529, Suleiman laid siege to Vienna, though the siege ultimately failed. Due to bad weather, extended supply lines, and fierce resistance, it sent an unmistakable message. The Ottomans were a global superpower, capable of challenging even the heartlands of Christian Europe. Yet Suleiman's greatness wasn't built on battlefields alone. At home, he embarked on a sweeping program of legal reform. Ottoman law had long been a mix of Islamic Sharia and imperial edicts, but under Suleiman, this system was codified and clarified. He standardized laws on property rights, taxation, criminal justice, and civil matters. These reforms earned him the title Kanuni, the lawgiver, and ensured stability across a sprawling, diverse empire. Suleiman also revolutionized the Ottoman administrative system. He appointed skilled viziers and governors, reorganized the military, and established a meritocratic bureaucracy, one that allowed talented individuals, even those born outside the empire, to rise through the ranks. This ensured a steady supply of capable administrators, regardless of birth or background. The Sultan's court became a center of culture and artistic achievement. Architecture flourished under the guidance of the legendary architect Mimar Sinan, whose masterpieces, including the Suleimani Mosque in Istanbul, still dominate the city skyline. Ottoman miniature painting, calligraphy, and ceramics reached new heights. Even Suleiman himself was a poet of renown, writing under the pen name Mahibi. His verses revealed a man deeply introspective, passionate, and complex. But perhaps no figure influenced Suleiman more than a woman, Harem Sultan, known in the West as Roxolana. A former concubine of Ukrainian origin, she captivated the Sultan's heart and mind. In an unprecedented move, Suleiman legally married her, breaking centuries of Ottoman tradition. Her became not just a wife, but a political advisor and queen in all but name. Together, they navigated the treacherous waters of palace politics, but their love story would also trigger deadly rivalries within the court, including the tragic execution of Suleiman's closest friend and Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, and later his own son, Mustafa. Despite these personal turmoils, Suleiman continued to project strength abroad. He fought wars against the Safavids in Persia, pushed deeper into North Africa, and challenged the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean. Under his reign, the Ottoman navy, led by the famed Admiral Barbarossa Hayreddin Pasha, became a maritime force to rival Spain and Venice. By the time of his death in 1566, during yet another campaign in Hungary, Suleiman ruled over an empire that spanned more than 1.5 million square miles and governed over 25 million people. His legacy was immense. He left behind a realm stronger, richer, and more administratively sound than any before him. But this zenith also carried the seeds of decline. As future segments will explore, the centralization of power, the growing role of palace intrigue, and the inability of future sultans to match Suleiman's brilliance would slowly unravel the empire he built. Still, during his 46-year reign, Suleiman the Magnificent carved a place for the Ottoman Empire at the center of global history, not just as a military colossus, but as a beacon of law, culture, and civilization. In the centuries to come, his name will become synonymous not just with conquest, but with the very idea of empire at its most glorious. As the shadow of Sultan Suleiman, the Magnificent stretched across 3 continents. A quieter revolution was taking root deep within the marble walls of Topkapi Palace, in the very heart of the harem. It was here, behind the veils and silken drapes, that women would begin to wield unprecedented political power. What began as private influence during Suleiman's reign blossomed into a formalized era of political dominance known as the Sultanate of Women, a century-long epoch where the imperial harem became the true seat of power in the Ottoman Empire. The term Sultanate of Women may seem paradoxical at first glance. The Ottomans were a deeply patriarchal society. Women, especially those in the palace, were expected to remain behind the scenes, their roles confined to motherhood, domesticity, and ceremonial appearances. But in practice, the women closest to the Sultan, especially his mother, Valide Sultan, and chief consort, could and often did become the power behind the throne. This shift began in earnest with Hurrem Sultan, the enigmatic consort and later legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent. Born in the early 1500s as Roxolana, likely in what is now Ukraine, she was captured by Tatar raiders and sold into slavery, eventually entering Suleiman's harem. Her intelligence, wit, and political savvy quickly captivated the Sultan. Against all protocol, he freed and married her, elevating her to the role of queen in all but title. Hurrem's influence was revolutionary. She corresponded with foreign leaders, commissioned architectural projects, and advised the Sultan on state matters. Her fierce rivalry with Suleiman's other concubines and his eldest son Mustafa led to a web of intrigue that culminated in Mustafa's execution, a devastating decision that many historians believe Hurrem orchestrated to pave the way for her own son's ascension. With Hurrem's death in 1558 and Suleiman's in 1566, the power she helped normalize did not fade. Instead, it flourished. Her son, Selim II, known as Selim the Sot, due to his reputation for indulgence, lacked his father's discipline and vision. In the void of strong leadership, the Valide Sultan, Hurrem's daughter-in-law Nurbanu Sultan, became the de facto ruler. Nurbanu, a Venetian noblewoman by birth, possibly named Cecilia Venier Baffo before her capture, was the first Valide Sultan to hold genuine political authority. She managed court factions, brokered alliances, and corresponded with the Republic of Venice, influencing foreign policy in the empire's favor. Nurbanu's influence was matched and in many ways surpassed by her successor and daughter-in-law, Kozum Sultan, arguably the most powerful woman in Ottoman history. A Greek Christian slave, Kozum rose from concubine to Haseki Sultan, chief consort of Sultan Ahmed I, and then to Valide Sultan for 2 of her sons and her grandson. Her reign spanned nearly 5 decades, an era of remarkable manipulation, regency, and resilience. During the rule of her underage sons Murad IV and Ibrahim I, she ruled as regent, issuing imperial decrees and managing the empire through a turbulent period of palace coups, civil unrest, and war. Kozum navigated assassinations, rebellion, and the growing influence of the Janissaries, often using wealth and patronage to secure her survival. But power, especially behind the veil, was perilous. Kozum's life ended in the very palace she had dominated, strangled in 1651 on the orders of her daughter-in-law, Turin Sultan. Her death marked both the apex and beginning of the end for the Sultanate of women. Turin Sultan, too, would rule as regent for her son, Mem IV. But by her time, the influence of the harem was beginning to wane. Military commanders, grand viziers, and bureaucrats increasingly took over state functions, diminishing the women's control. The rise of the Kapila family of viziers in the late 17th century marked a return to administrative centralization, pushing the once powerful royal women back into more ceremonial roles. Still, for nearly a century, women in the Ottoman imperial harem exercised a kind of soft and sometimes direct power that stunned contemporary observers. Foreign ambassadors often remarked on their political clout. Decisions of war and peace, appointments of viziers, and vast state expenditures could trace their origins not to the divan, but to the private chambers of the Valide Sultan. Architecturally, the influence of these women is still visible. They sponsored mosques, soup kitchens, schools, and hospitals throughout the empire. The Yeni Cami New Mosque in Istanbul, a project initiated by Safavi Sultan and completed under Turin Sultan, stands as a physical monument to their ambition. What made the Sultanate of women extraordinary was not just the individual brilliance of figures like Hurrem, Nurbanu, or Kozum, but the systemic shift they represented. In a world where women were supposed to remain unseen, they seized control of the empire's most sacred institution, the dynasty itself. But this era of palace intrigue, family rivalries, and behind-the-scenes governance also exposed the fragility of the imperial system. While the harem had become a center of influence, the sultans themselves were often weak or disinterested. Succession battles, assassinations, and manipulative politics destabilized the empire's core, eroding the prestige and authority of the throne. In the coming centuries, the once feared Ottomans would increasingly struggle to hold their ground. The empire would still wage wars and win battles, but the cohesion, vision, and brilliance that had once defined its leadership were slipping away, hidden behind a veil of silk, shadow, and secrets. By the late 16th century, the Ottoman Empire stood at a crossroads. Its borders spanned the Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa. Its cities pulsed with trade, its palaces shimmered with wealth, and its sultans commanded fear and respect. But beyond the empire's western frontiers, a new threat loomed, one that would slowly chip away at Ottoman dominance. Europe, once fragmented and on the defensive, was rising with renewed unity and technological ambition. And nowhere was this coming conflict more evident than in the bloody confrontations at sea and on land, most notably the siege of Vienna and the Battle of Lepanto. The Ottomans had long seen themselves as the inheritors of Rome, and their push into Europe was both strategic and symbolic. In 1529, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent led the first Ottoman siege of Vienna, capital of the Habsburg Empire. The siege failed, but it was a harbinger of things to come. The Ottomans had taken Belgrade, crushed the Hungarians at Mohacs, and brought vast swaths of Central Europe under their control. Vienna was not just a city, it was a statement. If it fell, the heart of Europe would lie exposed. But Vienna held. Harsh weather, extended supply lines, and stiff resistance from the Habsburg defenders forced Suleiman's army to retreat. Though the Ottomans would make further incursions into the region, the siege marked the beginning of a long and grinding stalemate between the Muslim East and Christian West. By the mid-16th century, the battleground shifted to the Mediterranean. Here, the Ottomans clashed with Spain, Venice, and the Papal States for control of trade routes and coastal fortresses. The empire had a formidable navy, commanded by legendary admirals like Harem Barbarossa, who had terrorized the coast of Italy and captured key islands such as Rhodes and Cyprus. But their greatest maritime challenge came in 1571 at the Battle of Lepanto. This naval battle would go down in history, not just for its scale, but for its symbolism. A holy league, hastily cobbled together by Pope Pius V and composed of Spanish, Venetian, and Papal forces, sailed to intercept the Ottoman fleet in the Gulf of Patras, off western Greece. On October 7, 1571, two immense armadas collided. The Ottomans, led by Ali Pasha, deployed their traditional tactics, rows of galleys manned by seasoned mariners and reinforced by thousands of janissaries. The Holy League, commanded by Don John of Austria, had superior firepower and heavily armed galleasses, floating fortresses that devastated enemy ships with artillery. The battle was brutal. It raged for hours, with ships ramming each other, cannons roaring, and decks awash with blood. In the end, the Holy League emerged victorious. Over 200 Ottoman ships were sunk or captured, and tens of thousands of Ottoman sailors and soldiers were killed or enslaved. Ali Pasha himself was slain, and his severed head hoisted aloft as a trophy. The Battle of Lepanto was a psychological blow to the Ottoman navy, their first major defeat in over a century. Though the empire would rebuild its fleet within a year, the myth of Ottoman naval invincibility had been shattered. More importantly, it marked the beginning of European maritime supremacy in the Mediterranean. The Ottomans, once aggressive sea raiders, now found themselves on the defensive. The 17th century brought more challenges on land. The Second Siege of Vienna in 1683, led by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, was intended as a final push to break European resistance. The Ottomans brought a massive army and laid siege to the Habsburg capital once more. But this time, a coalition of Christian forces led by Polish King Jan III Sobieski turned the tide. On September 12, 1683, Sobieski's cavalry, the famed winged hussars, launched a thunderous downhill charge that broke the Ottoman lines and routed their army. The defeat was catastrophic. Kara Mustafa was later executed by order of the Sultan, and the Ottomans never again posed a major threat to Central Europe. This second failed siege marked a decisive turning point. From here on, the Ottoman Empire would steadily retreat from European territories. The 1699 Treaty of Karlowitz confirmed the empire's first major territorial losses to European powers, including Hungary and Transylvania, ending its status as an unstoppable juggernaut. Behind these defeats lay deeper issues. The Ottomans had failed to keep pace with the military innovations of the West. While European powers developed standing armies, advanced firearms, and efficient logistical systems, the Ottomans remained reliant on feudal levies and outdated tactics. The once mighty janissaries, once elite meritocratic warriors, had become corrupt, hereditary, and resistant to reform. There were also economic strains. European exploration had opened new trade routes that bypassed the Ottoman-controlled Middle East. The flow of wealth began to tilt westward, and the Ottomans, heavily reliant on taxes from trade, suffered accordingly. Internal revolts, provincial rebellions, and inflation fueled by the influx of New World silver further weakened the state. But perhaps most damaging of all was the creeping rigidity in Ottoman administration. Innovation, once celebrated under Suleiman and his predecessors, was now viewed with suspicion. Religious orthodoxy hardened. Reformers were silenced. As Europe embraced science, rationalism, and modern institutions, the Ottoman Empire clung to tradition. The Ottomans still had power. They could still win wars. But they were no longer setting the pace. The world had changed, and the empire had not. From the smoky decks of Lepanto to the bloodied fields of Vienna, the Ottoman Empire's confrontations with the West were more than just military defeats. They were signs of a slow but inevitable decline. The empire that once struck fear into the heart of Europe now struggled to hold its ground. And as its enemies grew bolder and more organized, the cracks in the once mighty edifice deepened, setting the stage for the internal upheavals and external pressures that would continue to erode the empire's foundations in the centuries ahead. As the 18th century dawned, the Ottoman Empire found itself no longer feared but pitted. Once a juggernaut that stormed the gates of Vienna and ruled 3 continents, the empire was now faltering under the weight of its own stagnation. Diplomats in European courts began referring to it with a term that stung with quiet condescension: the sick man of Europe. Though the empire still spanned vast territories, its military, economy, and political institutions were deteriorating at a pace its enemies could see and exploit. The phrase didn't emerge formally until the 19th century, but the conditions that earned the empire that title were already in full motion in the 1700s. The empire's administrative machinery, once admired for its effectiveness, had begun to seize up. Provincial governors, known as beys and pashas, grew more autonomous, skimming taxes and acting like mini-kings. The central government in Istanbul, bloated and inefficient, was increasingly disconnected from the realities of its far-flung provinces. The famed Janissary Corps, once the backbone of Ottoman military might, had by now devolved into a parasitic institution. Originally composed of conscripted Christian boys trained as elite soldiers, the Janissaries had grown hereditary and corrupt. They resisted modernization, opposed reform, and often revolted when their privileges were threatened. Their power was so entrenched that sultans feared confronting them outright, leading to a military that was increasingly outdated in a world of muskets, rifles, and disciplined standing armies. This stagnation was not just military or administrative. The intellectual and scientific fervor that fueled the European Enlightenment found little echo in Istanbul. Printing presses, banned for over a century by Ottoman religious authorities, only began to spread in the 18th century, and even then, with severe restrictions. Education remained rooted in religious instruction, with little emphasis on science or innovation. As Western Europe built universities, developed scientific academies, and published revolutions in thought, the Ottoman Empire doubled down on tradition. Economically, the empire was bleeding slowly. The lucrative trade routes that had once enriched the sultans, those that funneled spices, silk, and precious metals between Asia, Africa, and Europe, were now bypassed by European maritime powers. The Dutch, Portuguese, and English dominated global trade through their colonial empires, leaving the Ottomans dependent on tariffs and agriculture. Inflation, fueled by the influx of American silver into Europe, destabilized Ottoman currency, pushing the peasantry into hardship and rebellion. And rebellion there was. The 18th century witnessed a series of revolts that exposed the weakening grip of the central government. The Salauli rebellions in Anatolia, sparked by economic hardship and local grievances, dragged on for decades. Kurdish tribes in the east, Arab notables in the south, and Balkan Christians in the west all began asserting autonomy. Some did it through open rebellion. Others through quietly building their own power structures under nominal Ottoman oversight. Perhaps the most dangerous form of rebellion, however, came from the empire's own provinces. Not as war, but as independence in all but name. Take Egypt, for example. In the early 1700s, the powerful Mamluk Beys effectively ran the region without much interference from Istanbul. Though they paid tribute and acknowledged the Sultan's authority, their control was total. Similarly, in the Balkans, local leaders such as Ali Pasha Janina governed large territories as semi-independent warlords. These figures were not outlaws. They were Ottoman governors who had simply stopped listening. Against this backdrop of decay, a few sultans attempted reform. Sultan Ahmed III, r. 1703 to 1730, oversaw what historians now call the Tulip Era, a period of tentative modernization and cultural renaissance. It was a time of poetry, architecture, and Western-inspired reform. Tulips, imported from the Netherlands, became a symbol of courtly taste and aesthetic refinement. European-style clothing appeared in court. Ambassadors were dispatched to Paris and Vienna to study European customs and governance. But this glimmer of openness was short-lived. In 1730, the Patrona Halil rebellion erupted, a populist uprising led by a former janissary and supported by merchants and commoners. They saw the Tulip Era as indulgent and un-Islamic. The rebellion toppled Ahmed III, reinstating hardline policies and reaffirming the power of the janissaries. The message was clear: reform would not come easy. Sultans who followed, like Mahmud I and Mustafa III, made cautious attempts at military modernization. French advisors were hired. New artillery units were trained. Yet these measures were piecemeal, undermined by internal resistance and lack of sustained will. Every step forward seemed to be followed by a retreat. Meanwhile, the empire's geopolitical position worsened. Russia, under Peter the Great and later Catherine the Great, aggressively pushed southward. In a series of wars throughout the 18th century, the Ottomans lost territory in the Crimea and along the Black Sea coast. These defeats were devastating not just militarily but psychologically. Russia, once a distant northern kingdom, was now dictating terms to the Sublime Porte. The 1774 Treaty of Cukuk-Kainarka, signed after a humiliating defeat, granted Russia the right to protect Orthodox Christians within Ottoman borders, giving Moscow a pretext to meddle in the empire's internal affairs. This treaty did more than redraw borders. It signaled a fundamental shift. The Ottoman Empire was no longer a global player dictating events. It was being dictated to. For centuries, the empire had been the hammer. Now it was becoming the anvil. The 18th century ended with the empire bruised, fragmented, and fearful. Local rulers held more real power than the sultan. The military was no match for Europe's modernized armies. The economy was strained, the population restless, and foreign powers emboldened. The sick man of Europe label, though not yet coined, had become an unspoken truth among Europe's elite. The question was no longer whether the Ottoman Empire was in decline. It was how much longer it could survive before crumbling entirely. But there was still time, and there were still voices calling for change. In the next segment, we turn to the 19th century, where visionary sultans and reformers would attempt to save the empire through bold modernizations. But they would also face internal backlash, foreign manipulation, and one of the bloodiest eras of nationalist uprisings in Ottoman history. When the 19th century dawned, the Ottoman sultans faced an unthinkable dilemma: change everything or lose everything. The empire stood battered by Russian victories, humbled by European industry, and inflamed by provincial rebellions. But amid the gloom, a handful of reform-minded rulers and bureaucrats believed the empire could yet be saved. Their answer was Tanzimat, literally reordering, a sweeping, decades-long experiment to rebuild a medieval dynasty into a modern state. It would be daring, expensive, often chaotic, and in the end, tragically incomplete. Mahmud II, the prelude to reform. The stage was set by Sultan Mahmud II, R. 1808 to 1839. Realizing the house infested with rot must be gutted before it can be restored, Mahmud began by destroying the Janissaries in 1826, an event remembered as the auspicious incident. Cannon fire echoed across Istanbul as the once elite core was annihilated. Thousands died, and the survivors fled or were executed. The path to modernization was suddenly open, but the empire had also severed one of its oldest limbs, leaving it shaken and vulnerable. The Had-I Serif of Gohain, a new social contract. 13 years later, Mahmud's son Abdülmecid, I stood beneath the rain-soaked plane trees of Istanbul's Gohain Park and read a proclamation that stunned those assembled. The Had-I Serif of Gohain, 1839, promised the security of life, honor, and property for every subject, fair taxation, regular military conscription. For the first time, Muslims, Christians, and Jews were declared equal before the law, a radical idea in a society long defined by religious hierarchies. European diplomats applauded. Conservative clerics whispered of apostasy. Yet the decree passed, and the Tanzimat era officially began. Railways, schools, and telegraph wires. Reformers, most notably the brilliant bureaucrat Mustafa, Rezid Pasha, rushed to remake the empire's aging skeleton. Ministries were reorganized along French lines. Provincial councils introduced rudimentary local self-government. Western-style secular schools began training a new generation fluent in science and foreign languages. Telegraph lines stitched distant provinces to the capital, and the empire's first railway steamed out of Izmir in 1856, its whistle a promise of progress, the price of modernity. But reform cost money the treasury did not have. To fund railways, uniformed armies, and civil salaries, Istanbul turned to European banks, signing loans at ruinous interest rates. Capitulations, the long-standing treaties that exempted foreign merchants from Ottoman taxes, were expanded, draining customs revenue. The empire's economy modernized, but it did so on credit, handing European financiers the keys to Ottoman solvency. The Crimean War and the Reform Edict of 1856. When Russia again threatened Ottoman lands in 1853, Britain and France intervened, ostensibly to check Russian expansion, but also to protect their new investments. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, ended in an Allied victory, yet the real cost was borne by the Sultan: colossal debts and deeper foreign entanglement. In gratitude for European aid, Abdülmecid issued the Islahat Fermani, Reform Edict, of 1856, repeating and expanding the promises of 1839. On paper, the empire now guaranteed equality, property rights, and modern courts. In practice, Resentment flared. Many Muslims felt their privileged status slipping away, while Christians complained that promises were rarely kept. Nationalism in the Balkans. Reforms meant to bind the empire together often stoked separatist fires instead. The Greek Revolution, 1821 to 1830, had already carved an Orthodox kingdom out of Ottoman territory. Now, Serbs, Bulgarians, Romanians, and Albanians read the Tanzimat edicts as implicit permission to demand autonomy or independence. Secret societies flourished. Printing presses in Belgrade and Bucharest churned out fiery pamphlets talking of liberty and nationhood. Each uprising forced the Sultan either to expend scarce troops or to concede yet another sliver of sovereignty. The young Ottomans, pens as weapons. Inside the capital, a new generation of Western-educated intellectuals, the young Ottomans, embraced both Islamic ethics and liberal constitutionalism. Figures like Namik Kemal and Sanasi filled newspapers with calls for parliamentary government. They argued that only a constitution could align the empire with European norms and silence foreign critics meddling on behalf of Christian minorities. Their words were as explosive as any bomb, and the palace watched with unease. The 1876 Constitution, and a fading dream. Under intense pressure, Sultan Abdulaziz was deposed, and his nephew Abdulhamid II ascended the throne. In December 1876, sweeping the empire into a frenzy of hope, Abdulhamid approved the first Ottoman constitution and convened a multi-ethnic parliament. Cannons boomed in celebration. Young Ottomans toasted the birth of lawful government. Yet the ink was barely dry when a new Russo-Turkish War, 1877 to 1878, erupted. Amid battlefield disasters and diplomatic humiliation, Abdulhamid dissolved parliament, suspended the constitution, and restored autocracy, crushing the reformist dream with one imperial decree. Legacy of the Tanzimat. By the century's end, the empire was superficially modern, crisscrossed by railways, dotted with barracks, governed by codes translated from Paris, but internally fractured and financially shackled to European creditors. The Tanzimat had rekindled hope and introduced indispensable institutions, yet also inflamed nationalism, alienated conservatives, and mortgaged the future. The empire had tried to heal itself with borrowed limbs and foreign medicine. The patient could now stand, but only with debt collectors at the bedside and insurgents at the door. The sick man had learned the language of modernity, but he had not cured the disease. In our next segment, we'll watch as that disease turns gangrenous. External powers carve Ottoman lands while World War approaches. As the 20th century unfolded, the Ottoman Empire stood like a colossus with cracked feet, staggering under its own weight, unsure of how to proceed. Internally, the empire seethed with ethnic unrest, disillusioned elites, and a younger generation ready to reshape its destiny. Externally, it had become a pawn in the brutal chess game of European geopolitics. When the First World War ignited in 1914, the Ottomans faced a terrible question: remain neutral and risk dismemberment, or pick a side and gamble everything. They chose to gamble. It would prove a fatal bet. The Young Turk seized the helm. The final push into modernity began in 1908 with the Young Turk Revolution, a military-backed uprising that forced Sultan Abdulhamid II to restore the long-abandoned constitution and reconvene parliament. This movement, led by the Committee of Union and Progress (CUP), promised liberal reform and national revival. Initially celebrated by all ethnicities, from Turks to Armenians, Greeks to Arabs, the revolution soon gave way to disappointment. By 1913, following a coup, three powerful figures, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Simul Pasha, emerged as the empire's true rulers. Known collectively as the Three Pashas, they tightened authoritarian control and began to shift from multicultural idealism to Turkish nationalism. They were young, ambitious, and determined to restore the empire's pride, through war if necessary. The empire drifts toward the Central Powers. As World War I loomed, the Ottoman leadership weighed its options. Once a traditional enemy of Russia, and now suspicious of British and French intentions in the Middle East, the empire leaned toward Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Germans, eager for an Eastern ally, made enticing promises: military training, financial support, and a chance to regain lost territories. when two German warships, the Goeben and the Breslau, sought refuge in Ottoman waters in August 1914. The Cup seized the moment. The ships were transferred to the Ottoman Navy, complete with German crews. Soon after, under German guidance, the Ottomans bombarded Russian ports in the Black Sea, effectively declaring war without a formal statement. On November 11, 1914, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers. The die was cast, a war on four fronts. The decision dragged the empire into a vast, multi-front conflict. 1. The Caucasus Front. Facing Russian forces in eastern Anatolia, the Ottoman army launched a disastrous winter campaign. Enver Pasha, overconfident and inexperienced, led tens of thousands into the frozen mountains around Sarakamis in late 1914. Poorly equipped, underfed, and exposed to sub-zero temperatures, nearly 90,000 Ottoman soldiers froze or starved to death. The loss was catastrophic. 2. The Gallipoli Campaign. In 1915, Britain and France launched an amphibious assault at Gallipoli, hoping to knock the Ottomans out of the war and secure a route to Russia. Against all odds, the Ottomans held the cliffs and ridges under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal, later known as Atatürk. The grueling stalemate lasted months and cost over 250,000 casualties on each side, but the victory became a cornerstone of modern Turkish nationalism. 3. The Arab Revolt. Far to the south, discontent was boiling. The Ottoman promise of pan-Islamic unity failed to resonate with Arab leaders who felt marginalized and exploited. In 1916, Sharif Hussein of Mecca, backed by T. Lawrence of Arabia, and the British, led the Arab Revolt. Ottoman forces were attacked across the Hijaz, Syria, and Palestine, weakening the empire's hold on its most ancient territories. 4. The Mesopotamian and Sinai fronts. British troops seized Baghdad in 1917, and by 1918 Damascus and Jerusalem had fallen. The Ottomans were hemorrhaging territory faster than they could respond. The Armenian Genocide. Perhaps the darkest chapter of Ottoman wartime policy was the mass deportation and systematic extermination of Armenians. Fearing collaboration with the Russians and believing the Armenian population in Anatolia posed a security threat, the Cup ordered mass arrests in April 1915. What followed was not just displacement, it was annihilation. Over 1.5 million Armenians died through forced marches, massacres, starvation, and executions. Villages were emptied, churches destroyed, cultural memory erased. Though modern Turkey has long disputed the term genocide, the overwhelming scholarly consensus agrees. This was a state-orchestrated atrocity on a horrific scale. Collapse and capitulation. By late 1918, the writing was on the wall. Germany and Austria-Hungary teetered on defeat. The Ottoman treasury was empty, the army exhausted, and the population starving. The war that was meant to restore the empire had instead accelerated its disintegration. On October 30th, 1918, the empire signed the Armistice of Mudros, effectively ending its participation in the war. Allied warships anchored in the Bosporus. Occupation forces soon marched into Istanbul. The three pashas, once hailed as saviors, fled the country in disguise, later hunted for war crimes and political betrayal. A ghost empire. The Ottoman Empire, once feared and venerated, now existed only in name. Its sultan held little power, its economy was devastated, and its former lands were under foreign control or in open rebellion. For the first time in over 600 years, the idea of an Ottoman future had vanished. Yet even amid the ruins, a new idea began to take root. From the ashes of empire, a different kind of nation would rise, led by a war hero from Gallipoli with a vision far removed from sultans and caliphs. The guns of World War I had barely fallen silent when the Ottoman Empire, once among the most formidable empires in history, found itself shattered. Its territories were sliced up by victorious Allied powers, its economy ravaged and its credibility all but gone. Istanbul was under Allied occupation. Yet even as the empire's institutions gasped their final breaths, a bold, transformative resistance movement surged in Anatolia. From its center emerged a man who would bury the old empire and carve a secular republic from its remains, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. The Ottoman aftermath, occupation and humiliation, The armistice of Mudros in October 1918 effectively ended Ottoman participation in World War I, but it came at a steep cost. The Allies, chiefly Britain, France, Italy, and Greece, took control of strategic Ottoman territories under the pretense of peacekeeping and reparation enforcement. In March 1919, British forces occupied Istanbul, seizing the heart of the empire. Ottoman soldiers were disarmed, bureaucrats removed, and Allied flags raised on key buildings. The Sublime Porte, once the nerve center of imperial diplomacy, now answered to foreign generals and commissions. At the same time, under the Treaty of Sèvres, 1920, the empire was dismembered. Greece took Izmir, Smyrna, and eyed more of Western Anatolia. Italy claimed Antalya and southern regions. France occupied Cilicia and parts of southeastern Anatolia. Britain held Palestine, Mesopotamia, Iraq, and Transjordan. Armenia was promised an independent state in eastern Anatolia. Kurdistan was proposed as an autonomous region. The once great Ottoman Empire was now a phantom, its authority limited to Istanbul and a shrinking circle of loyalists. Sultan Mehmed VI, the empire's final symbol. At the center of this crumbling edifice stood Sultan Mehmed VI Vahadeddin, the last official ruler of the Ottoman Empire. Ascending the throne in 1918, he inherited a poisoned chalice. A nation defeated, a people demoralized, and foreign boots on the capital's cobbled streets. Rather than resist, Mehmed VI placed his faith in diplomacy and cooperation with the Allies. He dissolved the Ottoman parliament, aligned himself with Western powers, and sought to preserve what remained of imperial dignity. But to many, his compliance made him a traitor, an emperor kneeling before foreign masters. The Sultan also backed a controversial military force, the Kuvvet-i army of the Caliphate, to counter the growing resistance movement in Anatolia. Ironically, this only emboldened the rebels and widened the rift between Istanbul and the nationalist heartland. The birth of a movement. Mustafa Kemal steps forward. While the Sultan appeased the West, a former Ottoman officer plotted revolution. Mustafa Kemal Pasha, a hero of the Gallipoli campaign, was dispatched to Samsun in May 1919 to restore order in Anatolia. But instead of upholding the empire's authority, he defied it. In Samsun and later in Erzurum and Sivas, he convened congresses that rallied nationalist forces. His message was clear. The sovereignty belongs unconditionally to the nation. From these congresses emerged the Turkish national movement, with Kemal at its helm. The goal was to establish a sovereign, independent Turkish state, free from foreign occupation and sultanic submission. By April 1920, the Grand National Assembly, GNA, was formed in Ankara, claiming to represent the true will of the Turkish people. Mehmed VI and the Istanbul government, now widely seen as puppets of the Allies, were declared illegitimate. War of Independence, reclaiming the homeland. Between 1920 and 1922, the Turkish War of Independence erupted. Kemal's forces, often under-equipped but fiercely motivated, launched campaigns against multiple fronts. Greek forces in the West were pushed back from Izmir after the decisive Battle of Dumlupınar, 1922. French and Armenian troops withdrew from the south and east after negotiated settlements and battlefield losses. Internal rebellions were crushed, often ruthlessly, to unify the nationalist cause. In September 1922, Turkish forces re-entered Izmir, and by October, the war was essentially won. The last foreign troops prepared to evacuate Istanbul, the end of the empire. In the aftermath of military victory, the revolutionaries moved swiftly to sever ties with the Ottoman past. On November 1st, 1922, the Grand National Assembly formally abolished the Sultanate. Mehmed VI, stripped of power, boarded a British warship and went into exile in Malta, later dying in Italy, a lonely, deposed monarch who watched centuries of empire dissolve beneath his feet. The Treaty of Sèvres was discarded, replaced by the Treaty of Lausanne, 1923, a far more favorable deal that recognized the borders of the new Turkish Republic. Foreign occupation ended, and international legitimacy was secured. A republic is born. On October 29, 1923, the Republic of Turkey was proclaimed, with Mustafa Kemal Atatürk as its first president. The Caliphate, the final vestige of Ottoman theocratic power, will be abolished shortly after in 1924. Atatürk's vision was radical and uncompromising: a secular, democratic, and nationalist state, Latinization of the alphabet, abolishment of religious courts, and promotion of science and education, women's rights, Western dress codes, and a sharp break from Ottoman traditions. In the process, Atatürk buried the empire, not with malice, but with conviction that its time had passed. Legacy of the last sultan. Sultan Mehmed VI, though largely vilified by Turkish Republicans, remains a tragic figure in history. He represented an empire at the edge of extinction, powerless in the face of monumental change. His failure wasn't solely his. It was a culmination of centuries of unsolved crises, delayed reforms, and external pressure. Yet the twilight of his reign gave rise to a new dawn, one that would shape the modern Middle East and define Turkey's national identity. The Ottoman Empire, though it crumbled nearly a century ago, continues to cast a long shadow across the modern world. From the bustling streets of Istanbul to fractured borders of the Middle East, from architectural marvels to unresolved sectarian tensions, the Ottoman legacy is not a closed chapter. It is a living influence. In this final segment, we explore the enduring legacy of the Ottomans, their contributions, consequences, and the powerful lessons they left behind. A multicultural mosaic. At its height, the Ottoman Empire stretched from the gates of Vienna to the desert of Arabia, encompassing a stunning diversity of peoples: Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, Slavs, Jews, and more. The empire's genius lay in its relative tolerance and pragmatic governance. Under the millet system, religious communities like Christians and Jews were allowed to govern their internal affairs. They paid taxes and accepted Ottoman sovereignty, but retained autonomy in personal law and religious practice. This model, though imperfect, helped manage deep diversity in an era when religious wars raged elsewhere. Today, this Ottoman model is studied as an early form of multicultural governance, one that held vast empires together through a balance of control and cultural accommodation. Yet its fall also highlights the dangers of inequality and favoritism. By the 19th century, reforms came too late to heal the growing divides between ethnic and religious groups, many of whom felt marginalized or betrayed. Drawing the modern map, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire radically redrew the world's political geography. Following World War I, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, Treaty of Sèvres, and Treaty of Lausanne led to the artificial carving of borders in the Middle East. British and French mandates created new states like Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine, often with little regard for the ethnic or tribal realities on the ground. These sowed seeds of future conflict. Ethnic and sectarian divisions were trapped inside hastily drawn borders. The Palestinian conflict, Kurdish statelessness, and recurring instability in Syria and Iraq all trace some roots to the dismemberment of the Ottoman domain. In this way, the empire's end was not a clean break. It was an explosion that scattered geopolitical fragments still smoldering today. Architectural and cultural inheritance. Ottoman culture remains embedded in the landscapes they once ruled. From the iconic Blue Mosque and Topkapi Palace in Istanbul to the bazaars of Cairo and the fortress cities of the Balkans, Ottoman architecture blends Islamic and Byzantine influences into a distinctive style. Turkish coffee, hammams, Turkish baths, calligraphy, and culinary traditions like baklava and kebabs have transcended borders, now embraced globally. Ottoman arts, textiles, and music continue to inspire contemporary creators across the world. Even the Turkish language, modernized under Atatürk, retains thousands of Arabic and Persian loanwords, a linguistic fingerprint of Ottoman cosmopolitanism. The Caliphate's shadow. Perhaps one of the most debated Ottoman legacies is the Caliphate. For centuries, the Ottoman sultans claimed the mantle of caliph, the spiritual leader of the Muslim world. When Atatürk abolished the Caliphate in 1924, it marked a profound rupture in Islamic political identity. In modern times, groups as varied as Islamist reformers, militant organizations, and conservative scholars have invoked the idea of restoring the Caliphate. For many, it symbolizes unity and a return to religious leadership. For others, it's a dangerous anachronism incompatible with modern nation-states. The memory of Ottoman leadership over the Muslim world remains a touchstone, sometimes romanticized, sometimes vilified, but always potent. Turkey's tug-of-war with the past. The modern Turkish Republic, forged in opposition to the Ottoman past, has never fully escaped its inheritance. While Atatürk stripped away imperial traditions to build a secular, Western-leaning state, recent decades have seen a revival of Ottoman imagery in Turkish politics. Under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Ottoman symbolism has returned to the national stage. The grandeur of the empire is celebrated in speeches, TV dramas like Darius. Erdogan enjoyed global popularity, and neo-Ottoman ambitions are hinted at in regional policy. This has led to debates inside and outside Turkey. Is this a reclamation of heritage or a distortion of history? Can a republic honor its imperial roots without undermining democratic foundations? The answers remain fluid, reflecting Turkey's ongoing struggle to balance past and future. Global lessons from an imperial fall. The fall of the Ottoman Empire offers enduring lessons for modern powers and developing nations alike. 1. Diversity requires fair governance. Tolerance without equality creates fragility. The Ottoman system of religious accommodation worked for centuries but collapsed when inequality bred resentment. 2. Delayed reform is dangerous. The empire resisted modernization for too long. By the time reforms were seriously attempted, it was too late to stop the decline. 3. Foreign meddling leaves lasting wounds. The carving of Ottoman lands by foreign powers created deep instability that still haunts global politics. 4. Nation-building demands vision and sacrifice. The rise of modern Turkey from Ottoman ruins illustrates the power of transformative leadership, but also shows how revolutions must balance the rejection of the past with the wisdom to learn from it. The empire lives on in memory and myth. While the Ottoman Empire no longer exists on a map, its echoes remain etched in stone, law, memory, and myth. Its mosques stand tall, its political decisions still reverberate, and its culture continues to inspire. Empires rise and fall, but their legacies endure. The Ottoman Empire was born on horseback, thrived at the crossroads of continents, and died surrounded by foreign flags and internal fractures. Yet its story of conquest, brilliance, decadence, and dissolution remains one of the most compelling sagas in world history. This has been the Crit Stories, and you just heard the rise and fall of one of history's most remarkable empires. Stay curious, stay critical, and until next time, keep seeking the stories buried beneath the ashes of time.